Hello there, welcome to Venture Capital. Today, the referendum on Crimea joining Russia will take place. We discuss the economics of the region and the financial impacts of both potential outcomes on Ukraine and Russia. Plus, we'll analyse the latest gas disputes. Ukraine owes Russia money for unpaid gas bills, and we question Europe's role in the resurfacing gas war between Kiev and Moscow. Plus, our in-house investor, Tim Kirby, is back for his second week in the job. Last week, he spanned the wheel and, as a consequence, invested $10,000 in Aeroflot. But due to the fallout in Ukraine, shares of Russia's flagship air carrier have taken a nosedive. So I'm interested to see what he's got to say a little later on in the show. But first of all, let's focus our attentions on Crimea, because today, the people of the region will decide if they want to be considered Ukrainian or Russian in a referendum. So first, let's take a look back in history and see why the ownership of Crimea is being questioned at all. So Crimea was conquered by Russia back in the 18th century by Catherine the Great and was part of Russia until 1954, when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave the peninsula to Ukraine as kind of a gesture. But at the time, it was all part of the Soviet Republic anyway, until the end of the Soviet Union, that is, in 1991. And then Crimea became independent with Ukraine. But the sea surrounding the region is home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and the population is Russian-speaking. But history and politics aside, what does the result of this referendum mean for the economies of both Ukraine and Russia if Kiev was to part with Crimea or indeed keep it? Now, the Crimean Peninsula is home to vast oil and gas fields. Deals with oil giants ExxonMobil and Royal Dutch Shell were believed to be in the early stages with the ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Investments that could have been absolutely crucial to Ukraine's economy, obviously during recession. So, okay, for more details, and we want to talk about the financial implications now on the Crimea result. I'm now joined by Mark Sliboda, Professor of International Relations at Moscow State University. If Crimea does join Russia, then what are the financial implications for Russia and Ukraine?
Okay, well, the financial implications for Russia, of course, will deal not only with what happens in the Crimea, which I think to some extent is already a fait accompli, but they will also depend on what happens in the south and the east of the Ukraine and how long this regime in Kiev lasts before it implodes. But if we take the Crimea in isolation, the financial implications, first of all, the Crimea's main industry, what it's best known for, is tourism. And this goes back to the days even of the Russian Empire, when the Crimea was a big destination for the aristocracy, the royal family, all the way through the Soviet period up until today. But the Crimea today is much more than just the tourism industry. There is an extremely valuable state-owned energy and gas business, Chornomornaftogaz, which produces almost the entirety of Ukraine's domestically produced gas. The Ukraine is almost entirely dependent for energy on Russia, but what it does produce comes from or came from the Crimea.
How much money are we talking about here then?
I think we will definitely see Ukraine lose large revenues in the process at a time when it can't even count on revenues from the east and south of the country, which are very close to a state of political rebellion. And those are the east and the south, aside from the Crimea, are the sources of the Ukraine's biggest, by far, industry, as well as exports. So the economy of Ukraine, at least the Putin regime controlled parts of it, are looking disastrous, catastrophic. They are bankrupt. They are heavily in debt. any aid that they may get in the future from the West is extremely conditional on IMF conditionality, neoliberal shock therapy that will have disastrous social economic effects for the population, mass unemployment, reduction in pensions, education costs. I think we're looking at I would say, a completely unviable regime in Kiev in the medium term.
I want to talk about the cost of taking on Crimea. I'm talking about paying pensions. Examples like that. It's not a booming economy, is it, Crimea?
No, it's not. The economy has a lot of potential, both for tourism and for energy. But as I've said earlier, it has been left rather undeveloped. So Russia has already given indications that pension levels and other social benefits in Crimea will be raised up to Russian levels, which are higher than they are in Ukraine. And that's before the cut that the rest of Ukraine may soon be facing. So obviously, in the short term, this will be a big draw on the Russian budget at a time when it is probably also going to be affected by Western sanctions. But I think for Russia, there are considerations more than just the immediate business in the short term that take priority in this case. Mm-hmm.
Politics at bay. All right then, Mark, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thanks
for coming into the studio. Now, another issue is gas, because Ukraine is still the main transit route for European gas, and Ukraine also relies on Russia for 60% of its gas needs. Now, due to the political chaos and an empty treasury, Kiev has not been paying its gas bills to Russia, the Russian supplier, Gazprom that is. But the Gazprom CEO, Alexei Miller, said Moscow will not be cutting the supply, but that this cannot go on. He voiced his concerns about supply to Europe and warned of another 2009 situation when Ukraine didn't pay up and gas was cut off, which did result in shortages for Europe. Now, although this risk has been alleviated slightly due to the introduction of passing routes, I'm talking about the Nord Stream, of course, but the facts remain. Ukraine owes Moscow money. Ukraine is on the brink of bankruptcy, but still needs gas. So let's talk about this in further detail with Chris Weafer from Macro Advisory now. Chris, Moscow is not planning to turn the taps off, but Alexei Miller has made it clear that this can't go on, this situation, indefinitely. So what happens now? We know Ukraine doesn't have the money. It can't pay these bills. What next?
Well, I think the gas bill, the outstanding bill, and the requirement going forward will have to be part of any negotiations between the government in Kiev and the IMF and the EU. We know that talks are already taking place between the government in Kiev and those organizations with a view to getting at least some emergency financial aid so that the government will be able to continue to pay its debt and pay its obligations. The more substantive bailout talks, we believe, will only take place after, if you like, the newly elected government is put in place, perhaps in the summer or in the autumn. But the gas bill, the $2 billion already due, must be part of the emergency bailout that Kiev is negotiating. And I think that's what Russia is basically saying, is that they want to be paid. They're not cranking up the pressure immediately, threatening to cut off today or tomorrow, but they want to make sure that the gas bill is part of any emergency aid that Kiev gets so that they can get paid.
Can I ask you now about the sanctions then, or potential sanctions, if Crimea does go towards Russia and sanctions are imposed?
Yes.
Chris, what would that mean for the Russian economy then?
So there's already damage, but it could get a lot worse if the sanctions are cranked up. And the way we're looking at it is that sanctions usually come in 4 stages. We've had stage 1, which is very mild, the suspension of visa, trade talks, and a warning. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is usually where we crank up to, say, targeting individuals or some specific sanctions, which are not necessarily economically damaging, but more in the inconvenience category. Perhaps suspension extension of G8, stuff like that. That's what I would expect to see early next week, rather than the more serious sanctions of putting some restrictions on Russian banks' access to capital markets, for example, or some trade restrictions. Because those sanctions also have implications for the EU economy because of Russia's important position as both a trade partner and an energy supplier. So I think those sanctions possibly have a different red line. The assumption is the red line perhaps is East Ukraine rather than Crimea for those sort of sanctions.
OK, we'll leave it there. Chris Weaver, thank you ever so much for your time. I appreciate your comments on that one. But let's change tune and talk about Russian companies now and the situation in Ukraine. Well, it's a nightmare for Russian stocks, we know that, but especially Aeroflot. Shares of Russia's flagship air carrier Aeroflot, well, they've taken a nosedive. The company has dropped by nearly a fifth of its value just this week. This is due to the airline changing its flight routes to comply with the territory of Ukraine for aviation safety, so avoiding Ukraine's aircraft entirely. And staying with air travel then, traffic in Moscow is quite often a nightmare. So due to high demand, 8 new heliports will open in and around Moscow. The company behind the project, Aeroflot, eventually hopes to open 70 helicopter bases in the Moscow region. Moving on, Russian beer maker Baltica has decided to reduce the size of its beer bottles but keep the same price. This is due to the declining sales and increased taxes, with production in Russia down 8.5% last year. Carlsberg expects the Russian beer market to drop by another 5% this year. Now, someone who is going to be needing a beer himself after this week has got to be Mr. Tim Kirby, because it was your first week in the job and you put all of your $10,000 into Aeroflot.
Yeah.
What a disaster.
Yeah, I spun the wheel. It came up Aeroflot, which means air fleet in Russian, Russia's largest airlines. And unfortunately, this week, due to the instability in Ukraine, they didn't just cancel flights to Ukraine, but all flights over Ukraine. So as you can see here, the stocks just drop, 19%, and 19% of my money is gone. But I still have faith in the wheel, and let's see what I'm going to invest in this week. All money down, hardcore. And it's your choice, Katie.
Right.
What do you think that I should invest in?
My goodness, I'm on the spot here. Okay. Right, you know what? I like green food. I like to be healthy. I've got an appetite and I like to look after myself. Well, I am at the moment. I'm trying to detox. So what about Dixie?
Dixie? Then how about we go with Dixie, one of Russia's largest food retail chains. They have a ton of grocery stores all over Moscow and Russia. And people are always going to need to eat, so I bet it'll be very profitable.
Nice one, Tim. All right, well, good luck. I like your optimism. You haven't been deterred by your disastrous first week in the job.
Not at all.
I reckon it's going to get better from here because people eat here in Russia. There's lots of appetite, so that's good stuff. All right, Tim Kirby, have a great week and enjoy a beer because you deserve it.
Oh, thank you.
Well, that's all for today. Next week, we will be discussing the financial outcome of the Crimea referendum. But I'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye.